Hey everyone, I know normally when a new update comes out, I like to do a kind of like tweet reaction or like a patch note reaction, to Bungie's blog posts and stuff. But, these days we like doing slideshows, and so I thought I'd make one for today's Ash and Iron update. We're going to be covering lots of topics today, so without further ado, let's go ahead and look at our outline. Today we're going to be covering 6 major topics. It's going to be weapons, ability changes, Temporal Blast, which if you guys haven't read the tweet/update post, did kind of get nuked, and we'll discuss the implications in this little section. Artifact mods, which we've gotten 2 new rows with Ash and Iron, so some interesting artifact mods. I know the original artifact, the original 5x5 that we got from Bungie for the Desert Perpetual original race was not particularly interesting, and there's definitely some way more interesting mods. If you think of this season, not season, but mid-season update as like an Act 2, sort of like how Echoes had like an Act 1 and Act 2. Act 2 tended to have the most interesting artifact mods, and so this is not an exception. If we consider this like the Act 2 of Reclamation, then yeah, there is definitely some very interesting artifact mods that we're going to talk about in Section 4. We have perks, which I will expand upon more in tomorrow's video when I do my tier list updates. And then finally, we have changes. Changes is really just stuff that doesn't fit in the other 5 sections, so you can think of it like an other section, because there are some things that were left off the patch notes that Bungie didn't really mention that were changed in raids and dungeons. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our first section, which is going to be weapons. Now, weapons, most of this stuff is what Bungie said that they changed. So spread shot hand cannons, for example, Bungie said 8%. I did my measurements. It's around like 8.2%, which is pretty accurate. We have a new rocket pulse rifle, the exotic New Malpais. This thing has higher base damage, actually, surprisingly, compared to a normal rocket pulse. So compared to normal Mint Retrograde, does 19.2% more damage per shot. But then you have to account for the fact that Mint Retrograde, of course, has elemental honing, which gives it the edge when it comes to DPS. So you can see here, lower DPS, 3327 versus 3551. On top of the fact that, of course, Mint Retrograde has access to stuff like rewind rounds. This gun reloads really, really quickly, I will say, but it's not as good as just being able to shoot straight, of course. This thing actually has a higher fire rate, though, to compensate. Firing at every 0.9-ish seconds versus Mint, which fires every like 1-ish second. And then finally, this thing has 27 total shots, which gives it a total damage value of around 82,000, despite the fact that it doesn't have a damage perk in the same way that Mint Retrograde does, which comes in at 63k total. So definitely an interesting option, pretty easy to dump with, and I don't know, just like a pretty chill, good feeling weapon. We don't really have any good like kinetic slot dump exotics, if that makes sense, for DPS. And so I think this has kind of filled that role in a nice way. So, cool little addition to our collection of exotics that we have in the game. Mida multi-tool, I tested it with the high power ammo mode, which is like the 4th tier after you get enough kills. The DPS sucks. It is 593. That is terrible. As you guys know, the benchmark for like a good exotic primary is around 2500. And so 600 is, let's just move on. 2 new hand cannons that now work with Lucky Pants, albeit to, minimal or reduced efficacy. That's going to be Sturm and Hawkmoon. Now, Sturm, if you load up over 12 overcharged rounds, and then you let them loose with Lucky Pants enabled, that is going to be, 2400-ish swap DPS. Aureus, after the spread shot hand cannon buff, has a swap DPS value with Cascade and Vorpal of around 5,040, which is like not even close. So yeah, same thing with Hawkmoon, around the same deal, 2,500 DPS, same situation. Interesting that they work with, Lucky Pants now, but definitely not very impressive. Lord of Wolves, interesting. Bungie said that they nerfed it by 20%. I double checked in both the firing range as well as against Savathun, and I confirmed with another person as well. I'm pretty sure they just didn't nerf Lord of Wolves by accident. So I'm assuming that they will do that because they didn't. So it has the same numbers as before. I just assumed that that was a mistake. Le Monarch now has Seekers when you fire it through a hierarchy of needs ring. The Seekers are standard damage though, and it only shoots 2. So pretty standard, like typical bow, nothing really special to talk about there. And in terms of DPS, it doesn't really hold a candle to Tiku's, so we're not really going to talk about how that affects its DPS. Teraba, I believe Bungie said they reduced its maximum buff from Peacekeepers from double to 100%, down to 70%, my bad. And I did some measurements, and my measurements were super napkin math. A lot of the stuff in the spreadsheet right now, whether it's, PK SMGs, Lucky Band hand cannons, there's a bunch of abilities that I haven't measured with the new Savathun method yet. And so I have some napkin math that I use with Teraba, and I believe Oh, I just realized it is probably correct because I use body shot damage, I believe, for my new footage. Yeah, I think so. Anyways, regardless, I can confirm that Teraba was in fact nerfed to some degree. Whether or not my 84% number is correct or not remains to be seen. I will retest Teraba in the future. I just haven't tested it like super strenuously yet. I've tested a lot of stuff, as you guys have probably seen. Almost every single legendary archetype in the game has been added to the Savathun method, which has really precise numbers when it comes to base values. But for now, Teraba with PKs is not in there. So yeah, I can just confirm that it has been changed. And then finally, Whirling Ovation. I will show a clip on screen right now. I can't really quantify how much the charge rate has increased in terms of like filling the anticipation meter because I didn't really measure this beforehand. But I will say, compared to when I tried using it with an Area Denial and a Rocket Pulse before, it definitely feels like a lot faster to charge. But I will say, Whirling Ovation's main problem when it comes to damage was not its ability to reach a full anticipation meter. It was that even when you have a full anticipation meter, the time you spend charging the rocket, even at max anticipation, is still too long for the amount of damage that it actually does. So that's the actual problem with this rocket, and that wasn't really addressed by the buff that Bungie put out. And so, I'll show a clip on the screen, like I said, of, me doing a little damage rotation with it, and it looks nice and it feels nice, but it's not particularly amazing when it comes to DPS compared to stuff like Parasite. Okay, so that's it for the weapons tab. Probably the most time I'm going to spend talking about stuff on a single slide. Next up, we have abilities. So Threadlings were in fact buffed by 20%, or approximately 20%. For those of you that are wondering how Needlestorm got buffed, Needlestorm was buffed by about 8% with Thread of Evolution, and without Thread of Evolution at base, it was buffed by around 6.4%. So, small buffs to Needlestorm. Unfortunately, I am not the biggest Needlestorm enjoyer, as you guys know from my testing footage. It is impossible to get the super to consistently have all the Threadlings track to the target and hit them directly. They either track to ads or they track to nothing at all. I have tried plenty of times to get good Needlestorm tests on Templar, on Carl, on a variety of bosses, and even when there is nothing surrounding the enemy and I'm standing completely still and I'm point blank, I'm far away, I'm medium distance, it doesn't matter. The Threadlings will just go where they want to. And if a Threadling doesn't hit directly with Needlestorm, you actually lose a substantial amount of damage. And so Needlestorm, not one of my favorite supers to use for damage. And even if you hit all the Threadlings, it's still not that competitive compared to some of the other supers that we've talked about before, like Thunder Crash and Golden Gun and Nova and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not the biggest Needlestorm fan, even though it's usable if you want to use it on Warlock and you want to damage super that doesn't block your teammates. Empowering Rift, I was pretty actually excited. This is one of the changes I was most excited about. And Bungie said that you get energy gains when you're in your Emp Rift, right? And unfortunately, I tested, it's pretty small, right? So the way I tested this was I put down an Emp Rift and then I threw a healing grenade at one of my teammates, and I had Ember of Benevolence up the entire time, and I basically just waited for the Emp Rift to run out and waited to see when my grenade would come back. And with an Empowering Rift, my grenade came back in about 18 seconds, and without an Empowering Rift, my grenade came back in about 22 seconds. So not really a huge difference, at least for grenade energy. I don't know if it scales differently with melee and class energy, but not particularly amazing. And losing survivability to run Emp Rift, unless you're on something like Assembler where you're maybe trying to cycle healing grenade and extending it and stuff, yeah, it's not that amazing. I mean, it's okay. I mean, I don't know, if you're gonna run it for damage, maybe you could swap to it and run it for damage, because I'm pretty sure the nuke swap, as we'll call it, mode that's coming in the Epic Raid Race, you'll probably be able to swap your class ability and stuff like that during damage, but I'm not even sure if that's worth it, to be honest. Most people will tend to try and run Phoenix Dive or Healing Rift during damage to, just in case the well runs out or something. So yeah, I don't know, Emp Rift, I kind of wish it was a little better, but it is what it is. Next we have Weave Walk. So Weave Walk, two interesting things here. First of all is, if you tap Weave Walk and instantly leave it, you get 2-ish seconds of Woven Mail, I believe. And if you use it fully, so you expend all 3 charges and you spend that much time in Weave Walk, you get 20 seconds of Woven Mail, which is the highest amount of Woven Mail that anything in the game gives by far, right? Obviously, before it was 10 seconds. And you actually don't even need to consume all 3 charges. You just need to stay in Weave Walk for long enough that you expend 2 charges. So 2 charges worth from 3 charges full down to 1 charge left. That's enough to get you 20 seconds. And on top of this, it gives the full 20 seconds to your teammates as well. So Strand Warlock, this definitely adds to the survivability of Strand Warlock a lot if you're able to generate Arcane Needle charges very quickly. And on top of that, you could definitely see it being potentially useful, because these days we have a lot of like, for example, if your teammate's on Song of Flame and they're giving you back melee charges all the time, if you choose not to use your melee charges during damage, you could potentially pop Weave Walk and then give your teammates Woven Mail for like an entire damage phase. So that does require you to play Strand Warlock for like the duration of your mechanics phase, but potentially an interesting option. Like 20 seconds is a really, really long time, and you would only really have to pop Weave Walk once at the start of damage and maybe once like in the middle of damage for most damage phases. So potentially pretty interesting, but yeah, cool change. Number 4 is Weaver's Call. Now Weaver's Call, it was buffed so that like pretty much all damage will just spawn Threadlings, and because of this, because of how universal it's become, and obviously you can even use it on Prismatic Warlock for like a free damage increase. I was curious about like how much damage Weaver's Call would actually add. And so with it's kind of like Temporal Blast, right? It's kind of like what Temporal Blast, the way that it works. There is a certain damage threshold that needs to be met, and you can test this yourself by just like shoot a Honed Izzy at a target and you'll instantly get a Purge Threadling, like instantly. So it is damage threshold based, and there is a period after you spawn a Threadling where no matter how much damage you do during this period, there's an internal cooldown where you cannot contribute to this threshold. And so it's basically like Temporal Blast, where like Temporal Blast has an internal cooldown where any damage you do won't contribute to the threshold. And then past that, once you do a certain amount of damage, you get a Threadling or a Temporal Blast, right? That's kind of how it works. Now, even if you are doing and spawning Threadlings as much as you can, as fast as humanly possible by doing crazy high amounts of damage every time the internal cooldown is over, the DPS is only 226, which is like not that good. And that's on Thread of Evolution as well. I believe, yeah, Weaver's Call is on Prismatic too, so you would do even less on Prismatic. So 226 DPS, I mean, like for just running an aspect and not really having to do anything, that's kind of like chill, I guess. And of course, you can stack it with as many people as you want. It's not like Hellion where like only one person can get the full use out of it. So I don't know, it's like 226 DPS and you don't really need to do anything. Like I compare it with Ionic Sentry here just for like reference numbers, but Ionic Sentry, you do have to do stuff to get it, right? Weaver's Call is like, you just have the aspect on and you just do damage, right? So yeah, that's cool. And obviously it has synergy with some artifact mods, which we're going to talk about in the future slides. Number 5, we're going to talk about Eunoia. Eunoia, compared to before, now I will say my measurement strategy for damage is way more precise now than it was last patch. But I will say compared to last patch, Eunoia is doing 12.5% overall increased damage compared to how it was before. Now, how it was before, maybe it was like 1 or 2% off because it wasn't as precise. This season, or this patch, I would say, my measurement is very, very precise on Savathun. And so, yeah, it ignites every 2 shots without ashes now because of the tracking buff. It's very, very consistent. And it does about 51% more DPS than a base Hellion with ashes, okay? Also, another cool thing is that, I think I mentioned this already, but whether or not you have ashes, it will still 2-shot ignite as long as the target doesn't like fly out of your Scorch projectiles or something like that. So yeah, 51% better than a base Hellion, which is not bad. And then it also adds, for reference, it adds 216 DPS overall compared to Hellion. So Hellion DPS, we've already talked about this in previous videos. I believe it's somewhere around like the 600, like 400, 600 mark, depending on, whether you have Eunoia or not. And then the actual DPS increase from, let's say you run Sanguine Hellion versus Eunoia Hellion, right? What's the DPS increase? Well, Sanguine, it would be like plus 10%. So for example, on like a 3k DPS rotation, that would be 300 extra DPS for just your weapons. And then Eunoia, you'd be adding 216 DPS. So with the grenade stat changes, if you were to run something like 200 grenade, that would be maybe even like 400 DPS, or not 400 DPS, but 350 DPS, something like that. And so, with these changes, you could see Eunoia kind of creeping up to be worth it next to something like Sanguine, especially if you're not doing as much weapon damage as your teammates. If you're playing like more of a supportive role, like Tractor or something like that, you could definitely see Eunoia kind of taking over in that role, on top of, just being pretty good for like proccing, singeing and stuff like that. So yeah, that's it for Eunoia. We'll definitely have to revisit it when grenade scaling affects turrets. Also, for those of you that were under the impression that grenade scaling would affect turrets this patch, that change is not out yet. I don't know if it's intended to be out. They just said it was upcoming. They didn't say it was like guaranteed to be with Ash and Iron. But for those of you that were under the impression that it was out with Ash and Iron, it is not. Okay. So when it is out, we will revisit the topic of Eunoia and we'll, measure it and stuff. But for now, it's not it. Okay. And then finally, Boots of the Assembler, we did confirm, in fact, that it now works in your well and in your rift if allies are standing in your well or in your rift. So speaking of Warlock exotics that are good for damage, that are kind of changing the landscape, it's not just Sanguine, it's not just Eunoia. You should definitely have a Boots of the Assembler Warlock on your team. This is essentially a free plus 10-ish%, assuming that, all the noble rounds and stuff can keep up with all of your teammates and keep them all buffed all the time. At least when we were trying it with like 2 or 3 people, it seemed to be pretty consistent with its uptime. But I don't know, maybe with 6 people it won't be, who knows. But yeah, you should definitely have a Warlock on Boots the Assembler. It is pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay, that is it for abilities. Let's move on and talk about Temporal Blast. What a heartbreaking slide, eh? So yeah, first of all, before, if you guys remember my Temporal Blast video, you needed to do 800 damage with Enhanced Temporal Blast or 900 damage with non-Enhanced Temporal Blast in order to fully build up a Temporal Blast charge, whatever you want to call it, fully get it. And now it's 1200 or 1300, respectively, with Enhanced and non-Enhanced, which is a 50% increase, right? It's a lot more damage. And another big thing is that explosive damage no longer counts toward your requirement, right? So this is really big because weapons like rockets and weapons like heavy GLs no longer, like heavy GLs especially, by the way, heavy GLs, the majority of their damage is going to come from explosive components. And you should go try right now. Try it for yourself. Go pull out an Outrageous Fortune, put on Temporal Blast, and just watch how many shots it takes to get a Temporal Blast now that explosive damage no longer counts, okay? So pretty rough for certain weapon types, for sure. Area denials, I tried this myself just because I was curious. The tick damage on the floor from like the pools, it doesn't count as explosive damage for this specific thing. So area denials are safe, but everything else is, it's pretty rough. It's pretty rough. So let's go over some popular options here on the left, right? So if you guys remember, right, Opaque Hourglass used to get over a 100% increase from Temporal Blast. Now, not only does Explosive Bolts not trigger and count towards the Temporal Blast requirement, meaning that Explosive Bolts is basically useless now. So I'm sorry, but all of you that farm for an Explosive Bolts Opaque Hourglass, you knew this time was coming. That shit is ass, okay? So if you want the correct bolt to farm now, either farm for, actually, it's not even either. Just get Charge Bolts. Just get Charge Bolts, okay? That Charge Bolts, the damage over time from each bolt stacks, although you can't see the visual numbers of it stacking over and over, but it does the damage to the health bar, okay? So Charge Bolt is going to be the best out of all of the options here. And it does, again, like almost 1900 damage per shot in +0 rad with no well or like 200 weapons or anything like that. And unlike what people have been saying, right? A lot of people have been saying, oh, maybe Spring Auger works, or maybe Explosive still works, or maybe Charge Bolt works, okay? Because of the increased requirement to get Temporal Blast now, that's 1200, 1300, your ass is never getting Temporal Blast from Charge Bolts like DOT before your next shot is required, okay? You're just never going to get a Temporal Blast every shot. Like, I'm sorry, but it's just not happening, right? And then like Spring Auger, for example, that amount of damage that you do after you shoot is insanely small. It is insanely small, and I wouldn't be surprised if it counted as explosive damage, which means it doesn't count towards Temporal Blast requirement. So basically what I'm saying is, in the DP raid, just use Enhanced Temporal Armaments, okay? Just use the 17% increase. You can use Temporal Blast if you want, but it's going to be slightly worse, okay? It's like a 14.2% increase now, which also means, by the way, that the crossbow is dog shit now, okay? This weapon is terrible. I will do some more experimentation in the future with stuff like Bacchus and Impetus and, you know, Speed Loader Slacks and Rain of Fire and stuff like that, because the crossbow actually can fire quite quickly at its maximum fire rate if you give it some reload assists, and I'll test Bolt Scavenger and stuff like that too. But at base, if you're just manually reloading the crossbow with Temporal Blast or Temporal Armaments, this thing is shit, okay? I mean, I said it was going to happen once Temporal Blast got nuked or removed, and it's happened, okay? The when and where. This rocket used to get, like, I don't know, like a 70% increase if you got Temporal Blast every shot. Then it was like a 35% increase if you got it every other shot. Now, Temporal Blast, by the way, the damage values of Temporal Blast have also been nuked, like, very heavily, okay? Which we'll talk about when we get to the right side of the slide. But the when and where, yeah, down from 35% to like 11.6% increase. Just use Temporal Armaments, okay? And then finally, Mint Retrograde, same deal, okay? 11.3% increase. Basically, with Temporal Blast, you're looking at like a 10 to 15% increase depending on the weapon type. I will do more testing in the future on stuff like swords, right? Because like swords, it literally went up, as you can see on the right side here. But yeah, for the most part, this mod is kind of dead in the water now. I mean, you can see the results for yourself, right? I basically went through every archetype that people have been asking me to test or have been thinking is relevant. SMGs, hand cannons, bows, minus 52%, minus 39%, minus 52%. So Bungie, by the way, is no longer, apparently, from what we're seeing here, is no longer using the boss scaler of weapon archetypes to dictate Temporal Blast damage. They now are just kind of, I don't know if these are custom input numbers, but they don't really follow the scalar rules or anything. They're just kind of like, a lot of the specials are 315, rockets items, rocket pulses are 252. crossbows and rockets are both 536 for some reason. I don't know. There's just a bunch of common numbers, and they're all way more tightly packed together. Okay. The only outlier here is swords, right? Because swords have a really horrible boss scaler, by the way, right? Really horrible boss scaler. And so they didn't scale very well with Temporal Blast. But now with whatever underlying system Bungie is using now, they got a small buff. They got a 3% increase to their Temporal Blast damage, which, great. Good for them, I guess. But yeah, every single other weapon type that people use with Temporal Blast, that we're talking about with Temporal Blast, has been nuked into the ground. Minus 50%, minus 40%. I mean, look at the crossbow, minus 76%. Okay, I mean, like, yeah. Okay, so anyways, now that we've had a little funeral here for Temporal Blast, let's move on and talk about artifact mods. Yeah, new seasonal stuff, I guess, or new of the moment stuff. First of all, I'd like to say Threadling Proliferation, which is an artifact mod that dealing damage with like a strand weapon has a chance of spawning a Threadling, apparently is not working on bosses, or at least the shooting range bosses. So that's a bit unfortunate, I guess, because it would be nice to synergize with some of the other artifact mods that we have today. But yeah, let's go over the 4 main ones that I want to talk about that have been generating the most conversation. So first, we have Energy Acceleration. Energy Acceleration, it just sucks. Okay, it just sucks. I mean, if you read the fine print there, it's equivalent to like a 2.2% damage increase on like Mint Retrograde, for example. The problem with Energy Acceleration is that it's like kinetic impacts. If you guys remember when I talked about kinetic impacts, I didn't speak too kindly on it when it came out during, I think it was like Revenant. This is basically the same thing, right? It has an internal cooldown. It's like Temporal Blast. You do a certain amount of damage. It makes like a little fart, like a little single kinetic shockwave. But the fart doesn't scale with perks or buffs or anything. It only works with debuff. And it does 120 flat plus 0 raid and dungeon damage, which is like horrible. Like, it's really bad. So it's like, I mean, I don't know. If you want to have it on, you can. It's like free, like 1-2% extra damage, but it's bad. Okay, it's bad. I mean, it would be, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's not horrible on like Mint Retrograde, because like you could run around and just like shoot one ad at a time, and it procs on like one burst on Mint Retrograde. So like if you shoot like an ad, you would get like the little fart shockwave, a little bit of extra damage, and you can move on to the next ad, and then you wouldn't have the internal cooldown and stuff like that. But for boss damage, at least, it's pretty bad. Okay, number 2, we have Argent Quiver. Argent Quiver is like a meta-defining artifact mod. Plus 35% to primary bows and plus 25% to power bows. Consumes armor charge by doing so. It eats through armor charge really, really fast, but there is an artifact mod this season. I don't have the name in front of me right now, but it gives you armor charge for hitting crits with bows. So it's basically like a self-sustaining loop of just like doing a lot of damage with bows. However, I will say, yeah, I need to investigate bow damage a little bit more, especially given that hierarchy doesn't seem to have been touched as much as I thought it would be. So I'm interested to do some bow testing. And apparently also, yeah, Rapid Fire Striker. Sorry, somebody in chat just mentioned it. So yeah, Rapid Fire Striker. But yeah, Argent Quiver, apparently this damage bonus, I haven't personally confirmed this, but I've been told by trusted sources that it's stacked with everything, right? So it's not an empowering buff. It's not like Argent Ordnance during that one season where it didn't stack with everything. So yeah, it stacks with everything, right? Which is like, what does this bring to mind? Well, it brings to mind the crossbow. It brings to mind Leviathan's Breath. It brings to mind Archer's Tempo, Archer's Gambit bows, Attrition Orb bows, Hierarchy of Needs, Tiku, stuff like that. So we're going to be testing that kind of stuff in the future. But yeah, that's Argent Quiver. Next up, that Fresh Bullet Smell. I was curious if this was a stacks with everything type of deal with kinetic damage boost, but apparently it just gives you 2 kinetic surges. And if you try to use like 3 kinetic surges, it just like doesn't stack with that. So it literally just gives you 2 kinetic surges, like an exotic effect surges kind of thing. And it just doesn't stack with anything like else, any other surges. So yeah. And then finally we have Pack Tactics. Pack Tactics is pretty interesting. We normally don't get infinitely stacking damage buffs in the artifact like ever. So this is kind of the first that I've seen of this sort, right? And the way that it works is every time you deal damage with a Threadling, your next Threadling will do an additional, it's about 2 or 3 damage. I was testing in the firing range at plus 100. So I assume, in like an actual like raid or dungeon, it would probably be like plus 2 or something like that. But this stacks infinitely. So I'm going to just show you a clip that's like sped up in the middle of me grapple meleeing a boss, or the Carl, in the firing range like repeatedly. And I'm grapple meleeing for 10 minutes straight. And it never stops increasing. And it's always just 2 or 3 damage. Every single time I grapple melee, it goes up by a little bit, right? And so at the start, I'm doing like 400 damage when I throw a Threadling. And then at the end, we're over 2,000, right? So very interesting, I will say, very interesting. This doesn't stack with other people, by the way. From what I know, it's a personal buff, right? So if your timer runs out and you kind of try to piggyback off of someone else, I think your timer starts back at 0, or like your stacks start back at 0. And once that timer runs out, it's like, you're kind of screwed. So it's, I don't know, this is kind of designed, I suppose, to work with like a post-buff Weaver's Call, to work with Euphony, weapons like that, right? And obviously that artifact mod, Threadling Proliferation, if they ever get around to fixing that. So yeah, that's it for pack tactics. Enjoy the sped up clip that is no doubt playing on your screen right now of me grapple meleeing repeatedly for 10 minutes straight. And yeah, let's move on. Let's move on to the second last slide, which is going to be perks. So perks, I have a tier list update coming tomorrow where I will talk about all of the new perks as well as all of the new weapons, some of the leaked weapons from the Epic Raid and stuff like that. We'll talk about that. And then we also have 3 perks to talk about that are relevant to boss DPS. First up is Burning Ambition. Burning Ambition really hasn't changed much, in my opinion. For neutral gameplay, if you're the type of person who is using it to initiate Scorching, on most weapon types, it's not going to be that noticeable. There's one weapon type where initiating Scorching was actually viable, and that was the bow, because the bow only takes 2 shots. Second shot will Scorch. That hasn't changed. It's not like your first shot will Scorch. That would have been really nice, but didn't happen. And the other more viable part of Burning Ambition, which is completing ignitions, didn't change at all. So Burning Ambition, I just put it here because no doubt somebody's going to have a question about it. It didn't really change when it comes to boss damage. It didn't really change when it comes to like normal content either. Cluster Bomb. Cluster Bomb is interesting. So I'm covering it now because I haven't really covered it extensively in the past. The non-enhanced number, this is not changed from before, right? The only change is that Cluster Bomb with enhanced version does a 54% increase to overall damage compared to before, non-enhanced 49.3%. Now, this might look really big. These numbers are really, really big, right? But this assumes that all 8 of your clusters hit. By the way, when I say comparing against aggressive pack rockets, I'm saying if you were to use an aggressive like Hezen Vengeance or something, and you had Pack Hunter, right? And you added up the damage of all the wolf packs as well as the rocket itself, and then you compared that to a rocket with all of those things, so Pack Hunter and then it's aggressive and all that, and you added Cluster Bomb on top of that, the clusters would add an additional 49.3% damage or 54% damage overall, right? Which is, that's a lot. That's a lot of damage, right? So if you ever find a boss that is concave, or, you can fit a rocket inside of it and all the clusters will hit, clusters will be really good. Otherwise, most bosses, you're hitting like 1, 2, maybe 3 clusters, and you're getting like a, I don't know, like a 10% increase, 15% increase maybe, which is still pretty good. Don't get me wrong. It's still pretty good, right? It's like having Frenzy in your first column or something, right? But yeah, you just got to find the right boss model. You just kind of find the right boss model. Hezen is like the only really relevant rocket that has cluster, because there is a new rocket, which again, the name I don't know. I haven't gone over the new weapons yet, but I know there's a new rocket with cluster in the first column and some of the more important damage perks in the second column. Unfortunately, it's a high impact, even though it is a new gear weapon. So after the new gear system fades for that rocket, it won't be as good as Hezen. But yeah, Hezen, I mean, people, I don't know. My stance on cluster that I've kind of said on stream is cluster right now, it's like if you're the type of person who was using cluster because you really wanted optimal damage and you were like abusing time lost and going like rocket, super rocket, and just like grapple reloading and stuff like that, then, you're going to be happy, right? You're going to keep using cluster. But if you weren't using cluster and you were using Envious or Clown or using like the when and where or whatever, this change doesn't affect you like at all. So like, if you're a cluster user, you're going to keep using cluster. If you were not a cluster user, you're not going to use cluster because of this. Okay. And then next we have Reservoir Burst. Reservoir Burst, one of these changes that were kind of like folded into this patch, where Bungie is taking enhanced versions of perks and making them not give completely useless stats that no one cares about. So Reservoir Burst is one of these perks where instead of giving like a, whatever it was, like a mag size increase or something, or like a reserve increase or like an inventory, like ammo generation increase or whatever it was, now they gave it a 10% increase to just the buffed component. So Reservoir Burst normally 25%, right? So multiply 25%, just that part, by 10%, you get 2.5%. Overall, 27.5% buff. I've confirmed this personally. Oh, Reservoir Burst was +5 stability. Okay, well that's just wonderful, isn't it? Anyways, it's a 27.5% buff now, which is nice. That's cool. Makes it a little bit more competitive with Controlled Burst, although they are kind of used in different situations. Just nice overall. I always like, from the beginning, I thought enhanced perks really should just be dial the number up slightly higher on whatever the actual perk does, right? So that's pretty nice. And of course, when we talk about perks in the tier list update tomorrow, we're going to talk about how Headstone makes large crystals now, etc, etc. So yeah, that's it for perks. And then finally, our last slide is going to be some changes. So first, active super generation. You probably have heard about this. Outbreak has been nuked into the ground when it comes to active super generation. I believe G Miners posted a clip on Twitter of him getting pretty fast active super generation on like instant cast supers, so like roaming supers like Golden Gun without Nighthawk. He was still getting super pretty quickly, so I don't know if this is probably not intended. Probably going to be patched by Bungie. And then Barrow Dyad, I personally tested it. Didn't really seem like it was super great. Definitely falling behind compared to legendary SMGs, if it was not already falling behind compared to legendary SMGs that were pretty good. And then Hierarchy of Needs. Yeah, Hierarchy, not as much. I don't know. I was using it before, and I remember using it like just solo with like a single ring, and it was kind of underwhelming before. And this patch, I don't know. I don't really have any like super generation measurement stuff right now that I'm using at this current time because it takes a while to set up. But yeah, I didn't really feel that different. So I will definitely test bow damage, especially in the context of that bow increase from the artifact mods that we were talking about a couple slides ago. So we'll definitely talk about hierarchy and Tikus and stuff like that in the future. And there will be, I know a lot of you guys are asking, there will be a super generation investigation video in the future. I have a friend who works on D2 Foundry named Harm. They're currently developing a tool for super generation stuff. And when that tool is done, and when I'm done with the massive queue of videos I have before day one, and we'll get to that eventually. We'll get to the bottom of super generation in the Edge of Fate. And then a couple other changes. You now get Transcendence when you rally. Part of this change is that when you rally now, instead of giving you a period of insanely buffed regeneration, it just instantly sets your super state to like max, right? So because of this, you can't instantly start Templar anymore, which I guess good riddance, because like I don't test on Templar anymore for the most part. I use Savathun. So kind of just in time, really. But yeah, this affects VoG speedruns because in VoG, when you're speedrunning it, you obviously want to start the encounter and start Templar right away. VoG is very cooked now. VoG speedruns are very cooked, unless there's another way to start Templar instantly. But yeah, so that's kind of like a side effect. I don't think that was like really intended by Bungie, but yeah, because you get Transcendence on Rally and Rally Flags just instantly set your abilities to max, instead of, giving you regen, you can't charge up your Relic Super anymore when you rally and then pick up the Relic. Okay, a couple other things. Apparently Witness Pre-Break was patched. So if you guys know about the stuff where you can use like a Lasting Rocket or Exterius to break the buttons on the Witness, without actually doing the mechanics, that's patched. Apparently, I don't have a clip of this that I saw, but one of my friends told me that after Hobgoblin was over in Desert Perpetual, if you were holding on to a blue Chronon, it would wipe it from your character, right? So for normal players, this does not matter at all, right? But in speedruns, the strat was you would bring 6 blue Chronons from Hobgoblin, and Hobgoblin would be the last encounter that you would do before the final boss, and you would bring them all the way through the transition, and you would plunk them into the hoop at final boss, and in the hopes that you would get the 1 and 3, because obviously if it's red or white, then you die, right? So that was a strat back then. Unfortunately, if this is true and you actually do have your Chronons get wiped, this is much more annoying to do and or not possible anymore. And then finally, 2 more things. New Land Beyond, apparently the catalyst is broken. When they changed it so that it has like the little gimmick where you get up to 1,000 stacks, apparently the max stacks proportionally scales with the threshold for getting the free reload from the catalyst. So now, if you want to get the free reload from the catalyst, you need to have 200 stacks. So I'm assuming that's not intended and it will be patched, but just a little funny thing if you're wondering why your New Land Beyond is not working properly. And then finally, one last thing is apparently Dread champs have been added to the game. I think like Unstoppable Husk or something, and I don't know, something else that there's like maybe like an Overload Grim. I don't know, Barrier Grim. I think it was Barrier Grim. I don't remember. But yeah, there are Dread champs added to the game as well. So that is that's pretty cool. Okay, that's it. I just talked a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and tomorrow we'll do tier list stuff. Tomorrow we will go over every single new weapon in Ashen Iron. We'll go over every single new perk as well, and we'll talk about them. Okay, goodbye for now.